I read American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is a reread for me. And in fact, I started podcasting by doing a show about the TV adaptation of this book called Shadows and Shamblers. That was the name of my podcast, not the TV show, which is just called American Gods, obviously. So I am extremely familiar with this book. I have read it dozens and dozens of times. Why am I reading a Neil Gaiman book and talking about it on the internet after the scandal involved with him? I am going to have a conversation about that entire issue with my podcasting partner that did that show with me, the co-host Anya, for Shadows and Shamblers, and we'll release it on that feed. I will put a link in the show notes to that if you want to listen to that. So this will just focus on what's in the book, and I will leave out my thoughts on Gaiman and how bad behavior affects art and how all of it is wrapped up together or not. So this is a fantasy book that is set at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s in America. And it's a kind of urban fantasy setting, but I would say that the novel rests more in a weird fiction genre than urban fantasy. It just has an urban fantasy kind of setting, I think. And the reason that I say that it's weird fiction, and what I'm talking about there is stuff like, I guess, like Murakami, I'm thinking of, and maybe like Stephen King's Dark Tower to a certain degree, things like that, is just that there's like an edge of horror to the world, but everything, it kind of examines the obverse side or the shadow side of whatever the subject matter is. And then, which in this case is like, what is American life like? And, like there's an acceptable version of like, here is American culture. And then there's a dark side to that we don't talk about, that we don't acknowledge, that we repress. And then weird fiction will make that into its primary setting or something that the character kind of gets pulled into and can't extract themselves from. And that's really what this novel is. And then it has, like I said, a kind of urban fantasy setting, which urban fantasy has to do with the idea that there's the mundane, regular world that we are all living in and aware of. And then there's a magical world that most of us know nothing about, and that the magical world has to remain a secret from the regular mundane people. And that's basically what's going on for the main character, Shadow Moon, who is serving time in a prison at the beginning of the story and then quickly falls in between the cracks of society when he is freed and discovers that there is a secret magical world of gods and culture heroes who were worshipped by mainly immigrant groups in America and then forgotten once the subsequent generations of the immigrants were assimilated into the melting pot culture of America. And so these gods feed on the belief of humans, and they're manifested by that initial generation's belief. And then without the subsequent worship of the following generations, they fall on hard times and tend to live these like hard scrabble lives of homelessness, con men, or kind of like humble working class lives, like a taxi driver. You see one god is doing that, and on with those kind of jobs. And so that's why nobody knows that these gods exist, because they occupy a kind of like underclass position within America. And then there's also newer gods that are more powerful, but are not formally worshipped by American society. So, for example, the television or like the media of the television or the internet and computers, those don't have like a formal name in the same way that, like the Greek gods have names and stuff like that, but are wrapped up in concepts. And so you have the character of media who speaks through the television, or the technical boy who represents like the internet. And these don't have temples to them, but a computer terminal or a television operates as a kind of altar, if you will, or something like that for the worship of them in terms of your time and attention. And so there's a kind of competition between the old gods and the new gods that Shadow discovers that escalates into a full-scale war. Because these gods, despite being kind of immortal, can be killed or they can die. Although there's like degrees of dying, which is part of the themes in the book, is that dead doesn't necessarily mean like dead and gone. And so, like I said, Shadow falls into this strange world and gets swallowed up by everything that's happening. And I think that all of that kind of complicated world building that I just talked about, and the way that Shadow enters into it, and the kind of economic position that he holds and everything, is all metaphor for American culture, American life, as observed by someone who is not American in the person of Neil Gaiman. So he was living in America in the late 90s and wrote this book kind of based on his observations, but also by going on road trip all across the country. And so, like I said, Shadow starts out the story in prison. And I think that this is also symbolic. It shows the emotional starting place that Shadow is in, where he has no agency. He is completely resigned and emotionally numb to his situation. And so he talks about how you have to do your own time. You don't start any trouble with anybody. Just go along with whatever people say. Don't connect to other people. He talks about like, don't do anybody else's time for them, which is another way of saying like, don't listen to the stories of other people and then get wrapped up in the injustices that have happened in their life and try to do anything about it. There's nothing that can be done. You're in prison. You just have to serve your time. They're in prison. They just have to serve their time. And so there's like a disconnection, kind of like atomized from every person is like an island unto themselves kind of situation. And there's something about America there, I think, the very individualistic, the kind of exceptional individualism idea of America, that everybody is potentially like the next richest person in the world. Anybody could make it in America, kind of the American dream, I guess, which is also like a big theme in the book in terms of dreams. But that's not a dream for like the entire country. It's not like a vision for the people at large. It's an idea that has to do with you as an individual American or this other individual American. It's not like us as a collective. That's not the story that America usually tells about itself. It's a story of atomized individual people who are exceptional in some way. But the way that that's being depicted in the book is as a prison. It's a system that exists to control people. And it's exactly set against the notion of freedom, which is usually a fundamental association with the American project. That America is a nation of freedom. It is freedom for the people, that we don't have kings and queens and lords, that everyone is free. But of course, the way that, and this is examined later in the book as well, the way that the nation was started was as a kind of prison for the European countries. So they would like have a trial, a person would be found guilty of a crime, and then they were sent to the American continents as a way to get rid of them from the European society. And then furthermore, like people were abducted from Africa, but also other places as well, and then sold into slavery in the Americas. And so it's a place of its origins are anti-freedom. And that's never really left the country, and it's also not acknowledged. And so this is what I'm talking about when I say that it's set in the book itself is a weird fiction kind of book, because the story of America is freedom, success. And the obverse side of that, the shadow side of that we don't talk about, is that the system is kind of rigged. And the get rich quick dream of America is a prison. And that the entire project started out as a slavery project and as a dumping ground for the rejects of European society. There's nothing exceptional about a lot of the people who were forced to go on boats across the ocean and then dumped on this continent. But that's not the story that we tell about ourselves as Americans. And so I think all of that stuff is right there in the beginning of the book. And the only thing that Shadow is living for is that he's going to be released and reunited with his wife. But then he is called into the warden's office and they say, you were supposed to be let out tomorrow to go home, but we're letting you out today because your wife has died and the funeral is tomorrow. And so the one thing that he was living for has been taken away from him. And so now he literally has nothing left to live for. And so Shadow has to make his way back to his home in Indiana and attend the funeral of his wife. But as he tries to make that trip happen, he encounters all kinds of delays and travel problems until he's finally on a plane with a guy who calls himself Mr. Wednesday and offers Shadow a job. And then Mr. Wednesday basically becomes his companion and boss for the rest of the book, even though Shadow refuses to get a job from him here. But this is how Shadow is drawn into the world of the gods, is by meeting Mr. Wednesday and getting pulled into his plans. And like I said, he tells him no at first, and they end up getting separated because the plane lands in a place that's not where Shadow's trying to get to. And so he has to rent a car and he has to drive the rest of the way. And on the way to Indiana, he stops at a bar to eat some food. And when he gets in there, he orders his food. He goes to the bathroom to wash up. And then in the bathroom is Mr. Wednesday. And he says, yeah, so as we were saying on the airplane, blah, blah, blah. He continues with his pitch, which is a very kind of weird fiction type of a move that Gaiman makes here. So this isn't merely a kind of urban fantasy trope. I think this is a weird fiction trope right here, where this is kind of indicating to us like what the book is going to be like. Because like that would imply, if it's a realistic novel, that Wednesday followed him stealthily and that, somehow also obtained a car and managed to follow him and managed to like get into the building without being seen, and then showed up in the bathroom without Shadow noticing. And that's not what happened. It's just that reality just kind of shifted a little bit, and then boom, we're back in this absurd situation that Shadow thought that he could get out of. In weird fiction, the reality of the world tends to shift around the characters, and there's not kind of materialist explanations for things. And this is a self-conscious theme in the book, that Shadow has this preoccupation with materialism and kind of materialist explanations for things, even though he exists in a world where there are gods. And so while he was in prison, one of the things that he did to pass time was teach himself magic tricks. So Shadow is a magician. He is a practitioner of magic. But the kind of magic that he practices is a materialistic magic. It's prestidigitation. It's the kind of magic tricks where you're manipulating the orientation of coins with your hands so that to an audience in front of you, it looks as if you don't have coins, but they are being held in such a way that the audience can't see them, behind your hand or up your sleeve or whatever. They're a bunch of tricks, in other words. And that is what Shadow calls magic. And he is always searching for a materialist explanation for everything that happens around him. But there are not materialist explanations for how there can be gods, at least not in this book. And so when Shadow is going to the bathroom and Mr. Wednesday appears, like I said, that's not a matter of him following Shadow. He just simply apparates and he is there because that is a magical effect that he is able to do since he is a god. And part of Shadow's journey is learning to accept this aspect of reality that is not rational, that is not materialistic, that defies explanation. And so they end up having a conversation in the bar. They're joined in their dinner with a third character who is named Mad Sweeney. He introduces himself to Shadow as a leprechaun. And so this, continues to escalate the kind of weirdness, but also the urban fantasy-ness of the book. And he's really surly. Mad Sweeney is kind of a grumpy guy. And Shadow accepts the job offer from Wednesday. He realizes he has no life left to go back to now that Laura is gone, his wife. And that at least this will in some way give him a way to scrape by, to have a job, something to do. Mad Sweeney pulls coins out of the air, and Shadow interprets this as a coin trick because this is the hobby that he taught himself in prison. And so he wants Mad Sweeney to explain to him how this is done. And Mad Sweeney, just tells him, I just pull them out of the air. All this, putting it up your sleeve stuff and palming them, that sounds really, really hard. It's just easier to simply magically do it. Which again, is pushing this idea in the book. Gaiman is right up front just trying to put this theme in front of our face because this is going to be a major internal conflict for Shadow, and this is where, his arc begins in the story. And eventually Mad Sweeney and Shadow get into a fist fight over this situation, and then after the fight is over, they buy each other drinks and they get drunk together, and they kind of make up and make friends. And Shadow learns the trick of pulling coins out of thin air while he's drunk and bruised. But when he wakes up in the morning, he can't remember it, and he has a terrible hangover, and also he's sore all over from getting beat up, and on like that. The point being that during the time when he was able to pull coins out of thin air, he pulled out a very special gold coin that he keeps with him. And this coin represents life, which is an important concept in the American project when we talk about like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's a symbolic metaphor in the book for that exact phrase. It's the first part of that phrase. So the gold coin is life, but it's also associated with the sun, which has to do, with the lore of the leprechauns, their association with the rainbow, the fact that the rainbow comes from the light of the sun, and on like that. And also like the golden sun, the golden horde, and how all of those things are associated with each other. But also the secret identity that Shadow himself has, and that you have right there in his name as well, that there's a darkness to Shadow's character, but also an obscuring of his past that is kind of symbolized by his name. His name is an inversion of his kind of like true name, if you will, his God name, it ends up turning out. But Shadow's not aware of that. All of it is unconscious and under the surface. But his true nature is kind of represented in him pulling this particular coin out of the leprechaun horde. So this is not merely a gold coin, but is a very special coin, which we find out more about later. So Shadow wants to go to his wife's funeral and bury her and then collect her things. So they go to the town and he sees Laura at the wake. He finds out that the reason that Laura died is because she was cheating on him with his best friend and got into a car accident while she was trying to have sex in the car with his best friend while they were driving. So a really terrible way to find out. And Shadow's reception of the whole thing, though, is he is hurt by it, but he also has a certain numbness in his characterization. And so it's not like he bursts into tears. It's not like he becomes angry or, makes a scene at the funeral, like screaming at her or something, her dead body or something like that. He carries his grief very quietly and he doesn't let it strongly affect him. And in some ways, he thinks of it in his own terms as an adaptation in prison where he didn't allow himself to become overly emotional at any time because like it's not a safe environment to be vulnerable in that way. And so he's just used to bottling up his emotions. And so this is just another example of that. But I think there's something deeper going on where Shadow is deeply repressed and is fundamentally not free and is not interested in being free either. Like he was in prison and he's been let out, but he is continuing to behave as if he is a prisoner is kind of the point that I'm making. And that he enters into employment with Mr. Wednesday, who is clearly like a sketchy guy, and follows his orders and whatnot because Shadow does not want to be free. He wants life to make sense and be ordered in a way where his emotions don't have to ever get riled up. And there's something there to me about American society where we say that we're a nation that is dynamic and where people are free and creative and allowed to do all of these things that no other country lets you do. But there's enormous pressure within the system to conform, to have, like the American dream is like an individualistic dream, except that we're all supposed to be having the same dream, basically, right? Like we're all supposed to be trying to drive the same kind of cars and live in the same kinds of houses and have the same kind of successful jobs and on and on. It's not actually individualistic, it's highly conforming. And your success can be measured in the terms in which you are conforming to that standardized American dream. So if you don't have the good business job, the big house, the big car, then you're doing something wrong. You're messing up. And so the way that things are for Shadow right now, he's basically like has no home, has no job, has no future. This is the worst circumstance that you can kind of have in terms of measuring your life against the American dream. And yet I think that what the book is kind of representing is that this is actually, on a spiritual level, what the American dream is. Like, maybe materialistically, if you're conforming to the American dream, materialistically, you have a great amount of wealth. But I think spiritually, it's an extremely impoverished existence because you don't have any actual freedom. And you're never actually becoming yourself, quote unquote. You're just trying to reshape yourself to conform to that dream. And so I think it feels to me like at the beginning of the story here, that is what is actually being represented in terms of Shadow's behavior as it relates to Mr. Wednesday. So after Shadow finds out about what happened between his best friend and his wife and sees her at the wake, he goes to the burial and he goes to the grave and he says goodbye to Laura in his own way and throws his gold coin into the grave with her and kind of lets go and says goodbye. And then he goes back to Mr. Wednesday and he says, like, I just want to leave, too upset to deal with this place anymore. I just want to make a clean break and just, whatever it is that you wanted to do, like, let's just start doing it. Which is exactly what Mr. Wednesday wants. He doesn't want Shadow to be here. He wants to start doing this whole thing where Mr. Wednesday, is gathering the old gods together to fight against the quote unquote new gods like Media and the Technical Boy. And so he's not interested in Shadow's grief or his emotional problems. In fact, he's like, yeah, that's great. You want to repress your feelings? That's a good idea. And so again, I think all of that stuff is like, you could look at Shadow's time in the prison as being a child, and then he kind of like graduates out into the world, if you will, and then gets his first job. And the first job is like, yeah, don't have feelings. Just obey me and don't ask questions. Do whatever I say and you'll get money and I'll grant all your wishes, is a thing that Mr. Wednesday literally says. I'll make you the king of America. And that is the kind of like conformist American dream promise. I'll make you the most exceptional version of yourself that you possibly can be. And all you have to do to get there is just give up all of your liberty to me. So that's really something. And I think, like I said, the coin represents life in the, where you're saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as soon as Shadow gets that life, that spiritual metaphor symbol of the coin, he throws it away. He throws it into a grave. So it's gone for him. And what ends up happening with that coin is that his desire to still have that life with Laura and the repressed feelings that he has around her death and the circumstances of it, all of the business of not being done with his marriage, despite the fact that his wife is dead, bring her back to life. And so she's kind of like a zombie person. Like she's like a living dead. It doesn't like resurrect her in terms of like now she has a beating heart and all of that stuff. Like she's a dead person who can walk and talk. And she kind of follows him for the rest of the story, but she has the power to do that because of this coin that represents life. And in some ways, that life exists in the terms of like Shadow's old life is still trailing around behind him because he has this attachment to it. It's important to him in a way that he is not acknowledging, and therefore it's going to follow him until he reconciles with it. So then after that, like I said, Mr. Wednesday is going to go around and he's going to meet with various old gods and he's going to try to convince them to create an alliance that is going to fight against an alliance of new gods. And there's going to be a kind of secret war that's going to happen in America. And the first stop on that whole thing is some Slavic gods that exist in Chicago. And the major character here that we meet is named Chernobog, who is a god of like death and darkness and evil. And Shadow ends up challenging him to a game of checkers, which this reminds me of like when, in stories, someone will die and then they challenge death to some kind of game in order to delay the death. And then, usually they lose, but they'll make some kind of bet about the whole thing. But there's no like bargaining with death. You always end up losing. And that's kind of what happens to Shadow here. He makes a bet with Chernobog that if Shadow loses the game, then Chernobog will be allowed to kill him. But if he wins the game, then Chernobog has to make an alliance with Wednesday. And so they play the game and Shadow loses. And then he challenges Chernobog to a rematch with the same terms. And he accepts, and then Shadow wins that game. And so narratively, this would seem like kind of a cop-out that, this is like a mutually exclusive outcome, but both outcomes are achieved. And so, I don't think it is a cop-out. It underlines something about mortality. And I think the way in which the entire kind of American dream and the, modern American culture is in a state of denial about personal mortality. That, because if you think about it, like, what is the point of all of this materialist accumulation, all of the, becoming rich, becoming powerful? What does any of that mean if eventually you're going to die just like every other person, whether they are rich and powerful or not? Like, however good your life could possibly be, it will still come to an end. And so I guess what I'm saying is like achieving whatever expectations the culture has for you as being a part of the American project, there's no special reward for you in terms of like you'll have eternal life, or even if you become really famous and after you die, people still know who you are for hundreds of years. I don't know, it kind of doesn't matter. You're still dead, right? So there's a reckoning that has to happen with death and its relationship to meaning in terms of like how you live your life. This is talked about, like one of the earliest things in the novel is a reference to Herodotus, the ancient Greek writer of history, and how he talks about like call no man happy until he is dead. And there's a lot of like themes about dying and death throughout the book. But this is a really important part where there's a guarantee that no matter how this entire book turns out, the story that Shadow is on, Chernobog says, at the end of everything, I'm going to kill you because we made this bargain. You agreed to this situation. So that's an important acknowledgement about what's going to happen for Shadow in the future. Like all of the rest of his decisions are characterized by the fact that he's going to die. And it also sets up the fact that there's a relationship for the gods between the death of humans and their continued existence, that Chernobog is going to kind of feed off of Shadow's death, and that, there's lots of ways in which the gods survive, whether that be through worship, but mainly through sacrifices of people. And literal death sacrifices are extremely powerful, especially for certain gods. And so because Chernobog is a god of evil, committing this kind of murder of a willing victim would be a very powerful kind of food for him, I guess. And so after that whole situation has been established, they do some other stuff. They meet other gods. They have this big meeting at a place that's like a real place, a roadside attraction that's called the House on the Rock. And many gods are assembled there. And Wednesday reveals himself to be the Norse god Odin, like the head of the Norse pantheon, Odin, who is a trickster and a god of war and death. And he kind of tries to rally the other old gods there against the new gods. And then shortly after this, the new gods attack the old gods, and Shadow ends up getting abducted. And he's like kidnapped onto a train by these people who are kind of like out of conspiracy theory fantasy, that are like, are they FBI? Are they CIA? They're like some other shadowy organization. They don't seem to actually know what they're a part of, because I think they're supposed to be like a kind of manifestation of the way in which people have in America conspiracy theories. And this entire thing has existed for almost as long as America has existed, and has only become more and more powerful over time, I think, especially like in the age of mass media. And it's only gotten worse with the internet. Nowadays, conspiracy theories are like literally a fundamental part of the American government and the way it interacts with the media system right now with the current administration. And so this part of the book is almost prescient, but at the time when it came out was a little bit more like whimsical and fantastical, I think. There's a sinister edge to the whole thing, but these characters are like kind of silly. They're named like Mr. Stone, Mr. Town, and things like that, because they have like these very materialist, concrete names, because I think that that's like a kind of fundamental ideological bedrock to the American project as it came out of kind of Enlightenment philosophy. That there's this kind of contradiction at the heart of America, that on the one hand, part of its myth is that it is founded as a Christian nation, founded by pilgrims who were kind of extremists, the Puritans, and they were like so Christian that they were kicked out of England and European society, right? And so they had to found a new society in America, and that their pure worship of God kind of gave birth to an entire new nation founded on freedom and the ideals of God and Jesus. And then on the other hand, there's this more like philosophical root that gives birth to the flower of America, that is like out of the Enlightenment philosophers who are thinking about a kind of realpolitik, where every human is fundamentally like a kind of cynical stance, where everybody is always grasping for power. So we need to set up a balanced government that stops that from happening, and in no way like accounts for God being the one who orders society or makes decisions about the motions of history. God is kind of like something off to the side who like created the universe, but then took a step back from it and just kind of lets it do its own thing. And so all of the explanations for why things happen in the world are materialist, or they're driven by normal human imperfections and therefore have to be kind of accounted for within the structure of society. And that is those two primary forces are the kind of like tap roots of the American project. And they are fundamentally like insoluble, right? Like they can't exist together. They create all kinds of friction throughout our history. But I think they're right here in the story where you have these supernatural beings who don't have an awareness of the fact that they are supernatural creations that emanate out of the beliefs of the people of America, and then simultaneously have names like Mr. Town, Mr. Stone, which are not names, but are kind of like categorical materialist labels that simultaneously operate as like code names, right? So this is like the way the military operates and stuff. When you're talking over the walkie-talkie, you don't say your name, you say your code name, and you talk to other people with their code names. But these are literally their names because like that is, they embody literally the contradiction at the heart of America, I think. And so anyway, these conspiracy guys kidnap Shadow, and then Laura arrives and gets him out of there by murdering everybody who kidnapped him except for one guy named Mr. Town. And Mr. Town, in a lot of ways, I think is a foil or a different version of Shadow in the story. And he pops up later in the story. But after she rescues him, he has to make his own way to hook back up with Mr. Wednesday. And this gets him into a situation where he makes a car trip down to the southern part of Illinois to hook up with some people who are also old gods and friends of Mr. Wednesday. And along the way, he picks up a hitchhiker who's named Sam Blackcrow, and they kind of strike up a friendship, but he drops her off at her destination, which was along his route. And then he gets to the old gods in Cairo, Illinois, who are Egyptian gods of death. So you have Anubis and you have Mr. Ibis, who is Thoth, who is like the god of knowledge and writing. And there are many parts of the book that deviate from Shadow's story. I'm like skipping over all that stuff that have to do with gods who come to America and the experiences that they have, like how they were brought into America through human worship. And those interludes are supposed to be written by Mr. Ibis. And he talks about how he's writing a book. And so those stories are kind of from excerpts from his book. And maybe we could even read the entire novel as being part of Ibis's project on some level. In any case, Shadow goes to work for these guys and tries to help them out. And they run like a funeral parlor for the local community. And it ends up that Mad Sweeney shows back up at this point in the story and begs Shadow for his coin back. But Shadow explains that he gave it away and he doesn't have it. And Mad Sweeney gets very depressed at this news and then ends up kind of killing himself by getting drunk and staying outside and letting the elements kind of take over and kill him. And at this point, they take Mad Sweeney's body to the funeral home and they kind of have like a personal wake for him because he's just identified as like basically a homeless person. Nobody cares that he died. But Anubis and Ibis know who he really is, and Shadow kind of cares about him. And so when they celebrate his life, when they get drunk and kind of tell stories about Mad Sweeney, he ends up being at the table with them and drinking shots along with them and telling stories and laughing. And so we see the kind of like liminality of what death means to the gods here, the kind of strangeness and weirdness, the way that if you remember somebody and they live in your heart, then they're not totally dead, the kind of interdependence that we have in the way that we assemble our identity. We kind of make each other. In being known and knowing other people, we help to assemble each other. That is like ontologically true for the gods. So like the metaphor of that, or the spiritual reality of that, is literalized in a material way. And we kind of see that in this part of the story. But it's also important because, in going to the funeral of Laura's death, Shadow is very alienated by that experience, and he loses his entire community and his kind of like hometown and all of his roots that he laid down for his life. And on a certain level, he even loses his past. But here at a second funeral in the story, he is establishing a proto-community. He's made friends with these gods. And even though Mad Sweeney is dead, he continues to be a lingering presence for Shadow. And at the end of the night, they're very drunk again. And Shadow is like, "How did you do that coin trick? I know that you showed me, but I don't remember. Show me again." And Mad Sweeney teaches him to pull the coins out of the air magically. And this time, Shadow gets it, and he does remember how to do the trick. And so there's a progression here that's being directly linked to death, which I think in terms of like the kind of American dream, death represents a sense of failure, something that should be avoided at all costs. And the way in which failure in the story is actually the only way to gain knowledge or achieve progression. And so there's a direct inversion of how the American dream should operate. You should be building success upon success by conforming to the rules of society. You should be like going to a good school, getting good grades, making good connections, and then, maximizing those connections into getting a good job, and then achieving things at your good job and making more money, and blah, 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 on and on. Success upon success upon success. Shadow is failing upon failing upon failing, right? Like he's getting kidnapped, he's being dispossessed, and now the friend that he made has died. And yet through this, even though he's dead, he has made a friend. He has kind of integrated Sweeney into himself. So now he has a magic trick that he will remember forever. And I'm just suddenly remembering, like I passed over the whole thing with Chernobog, there was a really important coin trick element that happened there, where there are these three sisters who are kind of like the morning, the noon, and the night sister. And Shadow talks to the night sister and explains to her, like his wife has come back from the dead and he's really confused by it. And she realizes that it has to do with the life coin that he had and the way in which he gave it away. And so she plucks the moon out of the sky and it kind of becomes a coin in her hand. And this is a liberty coin, which obviously represents liberty. So you have life and liberty, which are these primary ideas that exist in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These are the origins of the identity of the country, but also like the American dream on a certain level. And so the way in which she kind of like plucked the coin out of the air, she kind of took the moon and turned it into a coin. And the moon's still in the sky, so it's like a representation, it's a piece, it's a magic symbol for liberty and for the moon, which is a kind of reflection of the sun's light. And so it's not exactly life in the way that the sun is life-giving, but it is about freedom, and that there's two sides to that existence. That what is life without freedom? What is freedom without life? You really need both of them in order to fully live. And so anyway, Shadow learned this trick. He's kind of built a community here. And then immediately, once Shadow has had that sense of that community, Wednesday sweeps in and pulls him away from the whole thing and says, like, you're coming with me. We've got stuff to do. Drop all these connections and obey me. Do the job that I tell you. And so there's an antagonism, a kind of friction between personal connection and happiness that Shadow is developing, the kind of progress that he's making, I would say spiritually in that direction, and then the kind of conformity that Mr. Wednesday demands in terms of like quote unquote success. And so what Wednesday does is try to hide Shadow from all of the other gods, because every god that meets Shadow is like very, very interested in him and immediately likes him and is attracted to him. There's all kinds of encounters with the new gods that have been happening that I've kind of jumping over, but they're very interested in him too. And so he wants to take Shadow kind of off the board, so to speak, and hide him away because he's a valuable resource, but he has particular plans for him and he doesn't want him getting drawn into anybody else's plans. He needs to stay on Mr. Wednesday's plans. And so he sends him to this place called Lakeside, which is idyllic Midwestern community. And at this point in the story, like it's Christmas Day when Shadow arrives there, and it's very, very cold. And on the bus ride, he meets a couple of teenage girls who are making their way back into the community, after like going to visit some people for Christmas. And he's introduced to the town by kind of old coot Mr. Hinzelman, who everybody in the community knows and is very charming and tells all of these great little stories that are kind of fantastical and over the top. But he's kind of a pillar of the community, an old retired guy who everybody knows and is very involved in all the community happenings. And basically Lakeside is kind of idyllic, but there's a weirdness to that idyllic nature. And again, I think this is all symbolic kind of America, that there's a kind of really nice veneer to the entire cultural experience of America. Americans are well known for being very nice and having lots of hospitality when people come to visit from Europe or wherever. Like Americans are very friendly, but then there's like a hostility that's underneath all of that, right? And then there's like the way that we deal with the rest of the world tends to be through our military or through very strong economic policies and whatnot. So it's not all like sunshine and rainbows, I guess I'm saying. And Lakeside is very much that. There's the weather, for one thing, is incredibly cold and dangerous. Shadow almost dies his first day there. He doesn't know how to cope with the cold in terms of getting heat into his house. So he has to learn how to do that, and on and on. And he also finds out that there's people go missing every year in this town. Young children go missing every year. And the young woman who was riding the bus that he met on Christmas eventually ends up going missing, and he doesn't know, like, why is this happening? He tries to go out and try and find her, but he can't find her. But in the midst of doing all of that, he creates connections and friendships with the local sheriff, his next door neighbor across the hall, Hinzelman, and, just various other people like the lady who runs the local restaurant and the people at the library and just all these people in the community who are warm and inviting. Shadow creates all kinds of friendships and connections with these people and continues to like be vulnerable and open up, even though he's misrepresenting himself to them and kind of he's calling himself Mike Ainsel instead of Shadow Moon. But in adopting a different persona, it allows him to explore this part of himself that's opening up and changing, I think. And he finds that this is a life that he has some pleasure in, some like genuine, like he feels like he belongs to the community and he likes this place. And at various times, Wednesday shows up and kind of pulls him out of this and introduces him to different gods. So he meets the goddess Easter, he meets Mercury, the god of money in Las Vegas, and on like that. And up to this point, I think the book feels extremely episodic. It feels meandering. It feels like it's not really has any particular destination. There's not like there's a kind of menace to the new gods, but there's no particular new god who emerges as a primary antagonist. Shadow doesn't have any definable goal because he's so passive as a character. He just does whatever Mr. Wednesday wants. And Mr. Wednesday's goals are obscured from us. And so the narrative doesn't have any particular drive to it, but instead has, like I said, an episodic kind of nature to it where, okay, here's a scenario problem. Now the scenario problem has been solved and we roll into a new scenario problem. And all of these things just kind of happen in a sequence, but they're not necessarily building a greater tension towards a larger like structural conflict the way that you would typically do in an urban fantasy or a fantasy at all, a thriller or whatever. This is another hallmark, I think, of weird novels, that the tension that they build has to do with the actual kind of like experience of exploring the weird nature of the world itself. And so a lot of the tension is like, what's going to happen next? Or what does this thing that's happening right now mean? And so you're turning the pages in order to kind of like uncover more of the mystery or to fall deeper into the mystery of the weirdness. And so there's a lot of elements in the story up to this point that feel disparate, but all of a sudden, I think Gaiman takes all of these elements and tightens them, and the novel suddenly becomes far more tense and driving, I think. And so what I mean by that is that by a massive set of coincidences, you have the hitchhiker that Shadow met after he was kidnapped by the weird government guys, shows up to have a dinner with his next door neighbor, and she recognizes him, and she knows that he's been accused of the murder of all of those people who captured him. And then they end up going out to a bar where the sheriff is on a date with his cousin, who turns out to be the wife of his best friend, who is having an affair with his wife. And so his best friend and his wife died, and this is the ex-wife of, or I guess the widow of his best friend, happens to be on a date at the bar and also recognizes him. And so he is in the community under a false name, and he's supposed to be hiding out, and this just totally blows his cover. There's all these people here who know about who he is all of a sudden, and these elements from earlier in the story suddenly pop back up in a way that creates a lot of trouble for him. And so the sheriff immediately arrests him and takes him in, starts looking into his past, realizes that he has broken his parole because he was released from prison early. And now he's in jail and he doesn't have a good way to get out. And since he's been reported into the system, that means the new gods know where he is now. He's supposed to be hiding from the new gods, but now they know where he is. And so while he's in prison, the television kind of turns on and the guard falls asleep, and he sees Mr. Wednesday on the television being interrogated by one of the new gods and is being made an offer to create an alliance with them. Mr. Wednesday refuses, and then he is shot in the head and killed. And it's very obvious that he really died. And then the Shadow is given an ultimatum. You need to join us, or we are also going to kill you or torture you, So conform or die, basically. And this kind of galvanizes Shadow to rebel against them. And then some of the other old gods come and trick the guards into releasing him into their custody, saying that they are with the government and they're going to transfer him to a prison. And so they make an escape with him. And then they make a deal with the new gods to recover Mr. Wednesday's body and kind of create a temporary truce. And so this creates a situation where there's a meeting between the old gods and new gods where Shadow is there, and they get his body back, and it operates as yet another funeral wake situation in the story that delineates a choice that Shadow makes. So, previously, he lost everything in his life. Then the next funeral, he has established connections, which he kind of reiterates on when he goes to Lakeside, where he develops as a member of a community and, develops connections with people and starts to build a home. And now he's confronted with the reality of death and his personal responsibility to the people that he cares about. And the agreement that he made with Mr. Wednesday when he agreed to work with him was that in the case of his death, that Shadow would stand vigil for him. And so Shadow, again, kind of conforms to the plan of Mr. Wednesday, but he does it out of a sense of actual human connection and not merely out of an obedience to the system or a way to defer his own human life, I guess, a way to numb himself against potential loss and sadness. It's more like he accepts the loss and the sadness, and he's creating meaning out of it by making this choice to stand vigil for Mr. Wednesday. And it's something that everybody tries to talk him out of, but he refuses, and he insists on standing vigil. And what this ends up being is that Shadow is going to be tied to a tree in a symbolic kind of death that imitates the myth of how Odin gained supernatural knowledge about the fundamental nature of the universe. That Odin was hung from a tree for 9 days, and this taught him kind of all of the secret knowledge that he knows about the universe. Shadow is also going to be tied to a tree for 9 days, and Wednesday's body is going to be laid at his feet. And so this will be a kind of symbolic sacrifice in Odin's honor that will help to give meaning to his death, And so that's what happens. He's tied up, and he goes through a lot of supernatural visions and then ends up literally dying and then going through a kind of underworld experience where his soul is judged, where he uses the Liberty coin to kind of pay his way through death. All of these relationships that he's made to the old gods end up kind of quote unquote paying off in terms of they show up in the afterlife to perform the kind of jobs that they did in the context of their ancient pantheons and ushering the humans who worship them through the afterlife process. And so it ends up that Shadow can choose what he wants his afterlife to be. And he kind of chooses a nihilistic afterlife with no paradise or no hell. There's just a nothingness, a rest. And this, I think, like, is the ultimate representation of like a type of apathy and numbness that is encouraged widely across American culture. This is the kind of destination that most Americans exist in terms of the American dream. Like, do you own a house? Yeah, it's kind of crappy. Do you have a job? Yeah, I don't really love it. It's not like the thing that I would rather be doing, but it's good enough, I guess. I'm not really high achieving in it, but whatever. The majority of Americans don't vote. The majority of Americans are in debt and they're in poor health, but they're not, necessarily having chronic illness and they're not dying. It's just like a very a very kind of nihilistic, middle of the road kind of existence. And so this seems to me to be like the ultimate expression of the path that Shadow has been on. And what this does is kind of like exhaust the different avenues of arrival that could happen for Shadow, where Mr. Wednesday promised to him, like, you'll be the king of America. And he could have just had like a very normal kind of working class life if Laura had not died and he had gone back home and everything just, kind of would have had a certain level of domestic bliss if there wasn't, material success necessarily. But now he has conformed, he's given his life over to his job, if you will. And the result is this very like thing that was crafted by something else, which has led to a place of, I guess it's not that bad. I guess I'm not that plugged in or engaged. I'm neither hurting nor joyful. It's just like a pure kind of numbness that I think most Americans lapse into for the majority of their adult life. But then he gets pulled out of this whole thing as the war between the old gods and new gods escalates. And at the same time, you have Mr. Town, who I said, is this kind of foil to Shadow, who is also following the orders of this guy named Mr. World, who is the kind of opposite number of Mr. Wednesday. Mr. World has ordered Mr. Town to go to the tree that Shadow is on, cut off a branch of it, and bring it back to him. And so that's what Town does. He goes to the tree, he cuts off a branch. And then as he's trying to make his way back out of the farm, there's a kind of supernatural effect that is stopping him from doing that. And then also Laura comes to visit Shadow while he's tied to the tree because he has been kind of calling out to her as he was going through his process of death. And she ends up drinking some special supernatural water that acts as a purgative for the death that she has experienced. And so she seems to like come fully back to life, in terms of like a superficial kind of appearance level. She's not actually alive, but she looks healthy enough. And she ends up hitchhiking and Mr. Town picks her up and they make a kind of superficial connection with each other that I think mirrors a lot of the ways in which Shadow and Laura initially kind of had a romantic connection as well. It wasn't based on a deep intimacy between the two of them because Shadow was not emotionally capable of that kind of intimacy because he wouldn't confront his past, which he does have to confront in his death process that I kind of skipped over. Like it fully confronts him with the fact that the relationship that he had with his mother, the way in which his mother would never tell him who his father was, his mother would never show him the kind of intimacy and honesty that he needed in order to learn how to have that intimacy with Laura. It was never modeled for him. And so he never learned how to have that kind of connection with another person that he loves. And the thing that he finds out about who his father was in that whole thing is that it was Mr. Wednesday. And so he is the son of Mr. Wednesday, and he is actually himself a god. And it turns out that he is Balder, the god of the sun in the Norse pantheon, which is why he was able to pick out the sun coin. And it's why he has this connection with the sun, and why his entire nature being hidden from him is why his name is Shadow Moon, because it's like a complete inversion of his true identity, quote unquote. And so Shadow, Laura goes off with Mr. Town, but Shadow gets woken up and pulled back into this whole thing. He's told the gods are confronting each other and you need to be there when it happens. And so Mr. Town brings Laura all the way back to where Mr. World is to deliver this stick. But it's all kind of been a trick because Laura just wanted to be delivered to where Mr. World was. And so she kills Town. She takes the stick, brings it to Mr. World. He explains that the stick is going to be used to create a dedication of the entire war between the old gods and the new gods, who are all gathering at this roadside attraction place that's like a mountain in the American South. He's going to throw the spear. He's going to dedicate the whole thing to Odin. And then for every old god or new god who dies, that will operate as a sacrifice, which will feed Odin far into the future. And so the entire conflict is kind of just engineered to create power for Odin, and he doesn't actually it's completely cynical, in other words. And it kind of operates in the way that many wars for America in the 20th century operate, I think, where, conflict is happening far from American shores, and those conflicts are calculated to engineer outcomes that will destabilize those areas and free up their resources for the exploitation of America as a government. So it doesn't matter who wins or loses because the conflict itself increases the power of America by decreasing the power of everyone else, is kind of what I'm saying. And the same thing is happening here, or that's the plan for what will happen. But instead, Laura dedicates she basically says, I dedicate this sacrifice to Shadow Moon, and then she stabs herself with a spear, but also impales Mr. World, who it turns out is actually Loki, because they've been playing both sides against the middle. Loki and Mr. Wednesday have been working together this whole time. And so the entire book is a kind of conspiracy in a way, that it even includes the other conspiracy theory stuff in an even larger conspiracy. And so this is kind of the big twist of the book. I think all of that tension that I talked about, that the episodic nature is kind of pulled into a sharp focus and creates a lot of drama. I would say that the climax of that is here, where the reveal of the deeper conspiracy of Mr. Wednesday and the way in which Laura kind of puts an end to it, at least for now. And so as Shadow tries to wake up, the goddess Easter has been brought to the tree that he's tied to, and she uses her power of resurrection to bring Shadow back to life. And then he goes to the place where the conflict is happening. He finds out about the conspiracy. He confronts Wednesday with it. He confronts Wednesday with the fact that he's actually his father. And basically, Shadow kind of takes responsibility for his own life. He starts to create his own dreams for himself. He begins to shape his life, in other words, around his own desires and not around the kind of conforming to the idea or rules that Mr. Wednesday has laid out for him. And Wednesday tries to claim, like, it doesn't matter what you do, this conflict is going to happen and all of it is going to feed me. And so Shadow denies that. He goes down to the battlefield and he explains to both sides what's really happening. In other words, he reveals the truth of the conspiracy to everyone, and it takes away their will to fight. They're not interested in the conflict anymore, and they just give up. And so there is no battle, there are no deaths, there is no sacrifice, and therefore Mr. Wednesday kind of does indeed fully die. There's nothing to feed him. There's no sacrifices. And so in a way, there's like a big anticlimax to the story. In a typical fantasy novel, I think at the end, you would want to have this really big conflict that you've been building to, this awesome fight between the gods. The whole thing is diffused and instead is given an anticlimax where nothing really happens and peace is made instead. And so I think the novel is giving us a model for heroism and goodness in the story. And there's that kind of conflict again between the story of America as a materialist project of Enlightenment philosophy and a project of, Christian theocracy, where you're laying out a kind of, here is a new nation, a city upon a hill kind of thing. Because this is a kind of, the peacemakers will inherit the earth kind of stuff that Jesus talks about. Blessed be the peacemakers. That's what Shadow is doing. He's behaving in a very spiritually enlightened way after he has died and been resurrected by Easter. There's something very Jesus-y about this whole thing, very intentionally, like in the way it's constructed, I think. And I think the book is ratifying this behavior as being the right path, the good path. And there's an embracing that Shadow is doing here of the spiritual way, instead of like, he's always questioning, well, how did this happen? What is the materialist explanation for things? Instead, there's like, he's following a more spiritual and enlightened path of telling the truth to people. He's not playing into the con artist games that Wednesday had all the time. Instead, he's just like exposing the truth. He's telling the truth. Again, that is a very like kind of Christian idealism type of move to make, instead of the kind of materialist Enlightenment philosophy of realpolitik, where people will always lie if it will benefit them and will only tell the truth when they absolutely are forced to. And so while this entire ending, I'm not saying that it is fundamentally Christian or like it's ratifying a Christian worldview. Instead, I think it's like affirming a difference between good and evil, and that the path of evil lies in cynicism, in self-serving, in lying, and in war. And that the good path lies in community, it lies in peace, and it lies in the truth. And so, like that Superman saying, truth, justice, and the American way, right? Like that is kind of the values that are affirmed by this ending in the novel, I think. And then the rest of the book has to do with Shadow ends up going back to Lakeside, and we had this mystery about the children who were missing each year and the girl that he met who went missing and he could never find her. He realizes that she was locked away in a car, and every winter a car is put out on the ice. And then when the spring thaw comes, the car falls into the lake, and every one of these cars has a dead child in the trunk. And that this has been a ritual of human sacrifice that the town has been unwittingly a party to, and that this sacrifice has been feeding the prosperity of the community this whole time. And even though everybody was not aware of it, they still there's a kind of manic energy to Lakeside where everybody insists on the goodness of the community, but there's a kind of unconscious, anxious awareness that there's a high cost to this whole thing. And nobody really acknowledges the way in which children always go missing every year, or the kind of grief and the psychic effect that this has in the community. But I think there's, again, something there about America, that our prosperity is built on a lot of suffering. And even though that suffering might be displaced to other nations, like I said, the way that we export war or the way that we export our pollution to other places and things like that, there is an awareness of that in America, which is repressed and which is unconscious in some people. But those people tend to be the ones who are the most that America is the greatest place in the world. This kind of overemphasis on how great of a place this is, and a refusal to acknowledge the way in which there can be any price for that greatness, that the greatness comes at some cost of great suffering as well. And in any case, we find out that this entire thing has been happening for a long time because of the old man Hinzelman, who is this charming character that Shadow made friends with, but in fact is a kind of evil god of child sacrifice who set up this community as a way to feed himself for the last 200 years. And the sheriff ends up killing Hinzelman, and then Shadow ends up taking away the memory that the sheriff has of that whole incident, because it has kind of poisoned him in a way that he's going to commit suicide or do something really heinous to himself out of a sense of guilt. And that the community is going to fundamentally change because it's lost its kind of spiritual patron, and things are going to become more difficult, and they really are going to need a good sheriff like him. So it's important that he stay a part of the community. He's going to be a pillar of that community. And then Shadow goes on to try and track down Sam Blackcrow and try to start a relationship with her, but she has already fallen in love with somebody else. And so Shadow kind of lets go of that desire, but acknowledges the way in which he wished that it could have happened. And there's a kind of promise that Shadow will seek out more friendships, more romantic connections in the future, continue to kind of build a community for himself, and maybe put down roots one day. In other words, to build a life that is rooted in actual true freedom. And so life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, but not in terms of the American dream that demands conformity, but instead is creative and personal and authentic. And then Shadow goes back to the Slavic gods in Chicago, and they keep warning him, oh, you shouldn't come back here. You shouldn't do this right now, because he wants to pay the debt that he made with Chernobog, that Chernobog gets to hit him in the head with a hammer. And this idea of death has been hanging over everything that Shadow does throughout, the entire book ever since that pact was made. And now Shadow has, hung on the world tree and gone through a kind of death where he had to examine all of these things about his past and meet all of these gods. But the one god, who didn't show up through that whole thing was Chernobog. And at this point, it's like spring is happening. The spring cleaning is happening in the house. They're getting ready for, the beginning of a new cycle of seasons. Winter is almost over. And so the three sisters, the morning, noon, and night sisters, kind of tell him how about not today? Come back tomorrow. And Shadow's like, no, I'd rather just get it over with. I have a deal. I'm going to keep my end of the deal, because one way or another, this thing is going to happen. And this kind of shows the way in which Shadow has learned to take responsibility for his actions and not, just go along with whatever. This isn't so much him being obedient, because if he was being obedient, if he was taking the easy way out, if he was just serving his time, so to speak, then he would do what the sisters tell him to do. But instead, he wants to face death. And this is a really important idea in the book, I think, because it's the way in which Shadow's actual life begins, the way that it finds its flavor, its savor, however you want to say it. That you can't hide from death. You can't avoid death. You have to live your life with the awareness that you're going to die and to take responsibility for that and meet it head on. And so he meets Chernabog, who doesn't quite look the same. He's not this god of evil so much. His hair is changing color. His disposition is different. And he talks about his twin brother, Beelzebub, who is like the morning, the light. And you figure out that he is kind of like a dualistic god. He's evil on one hand, good on the other. He's night on one hand and day on the other. The moon on one hand and the sun on the other. And so you have this moon and sun theme that plays throughout the book, the way that, Mad Sweeney was a leprechaun tied to the sun, the way that Shadow is Balder, who is the sun. So he meets this other god who is like him. Shadow is both the moon and the sun. Chernabog is the evil, Beelzebub is the good, and that's why they wanted him to come the next day when Chernabog would be fully gone and Beelzebub would be there, and he would be merciful to Shadow and would not kill him. And instead, he kind of sits in this place where he is both good and evil. And I think that is mirroring the place that Shadow has arrived at. He is both human and God. He is both, materially impoverished. He still, doesn't have a whole lot of money, but spiritually very wealthy, very powerful. So he has these, there's a dualism to him, I guess, that is mirrored in this encounter with Chernabog. And what he does is he takes his hammer and just kind of taps it on Shadow's forehead and is like, boop, there you go. I kept up my end of the bargain. I hit you in the head with a hammer, and you kept your end of the bargain and showed up for it. And there's a way in which, we can go through life and be afraid of death, and that can change our experience of life into something terrible. And it can make a monster out of something that's just a natural process, just yet another part of the universe, another stage of life. And the fact is, and they say this in the book, Easter says it, nothing in the universe really ends. It just changes. And death is a part of that change for people. And so I think when you face that, it takes all of the scariness out of it. You can build it up to be this big, looming, evil, terrible thing. But really, it's just another part of a process that you are involved in. And so this part of the book illustrates that, and Shadow takes responsibility for his death and therefore kind of transcends it. And then the very end of the book has to do with Shadow actually leaving America and encountering another version of Odin in Iceland and talking to him about his experience with Wednesday and realizing that the world is like a bigger place with even more to offer than maybe necessarily what was in America. And maybe he will go on to have other adventures and experiences, which does happen. I'm aware of the other Shadow Moon stories that Gaiman has written, but that's kind of the sense in which the novel leaves off. There is more to life. There's more adventure, more connections out there to be had in the world. So That is a lot of talking about a book that I have thought about for many, many years. I read the book around the time that it first came out, and I've read it almost every year since then, and then many, many times while I was doing the podcast as well. So I'm extremely familiar with the book, but I don't know if I'll continue reading it because my feelings are so conflicted around all of the things that have to do with Gaiman himself and my feelings about art and the way that art and artists are wrapped up with each other. And but I'm not going to talk about that here. That's just, my off the top of my head analysis, if you can call it that, the accumulation of many, many readings and many years of a book that has affected me a great deal and that I care about a lot, but at the same time, I do have conflicted feelings over.